Hamilton Jewish Film Festival. Tonight, we have a very special filmmaker Q&A with the screenwriter of Crescendo, Mr. Stephen Glantz. I will introduce Stephen in a second, but first I want to explain a little bit about how we're going to work tonight, how tonight is going to work. I'm going to be leading a discussion with Mr. Glantz for about an hour, and I'm going to try my hardest to incorporate questions from everybody watching. So if you'd like to ask a question that is relevant to the film in our discussion, please type it into the Q&A box, and I'm going to do my best to monitor that as we have our chat. So my name is Benjamin Wright, if you don't see that on your screen. I'm an independent film and media scholar based in Windsor, Ontario. I have previously taught at the University of Toronto in the Cinema Studies Institute, and I was the inaugural Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Southern California in the School of Cinematic Arts. And it is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Glantz. Stephen is an award-winning screenwriter and author whose most recent nonfiction book, Clara's War, was named a Sophie Brody Honor Book by the American Library Association. And for the past 20 years, most of Stephen's work has focused on issues of race, genocide, politics, and young people in areas of conflict. Crescendo, his most recent film, directed by Dror Zahavi, premiered at the Munich Film Festival in 2020. And since the year 2000, Stephen has worked extensively in Germany for Arthur Bronner, Alice Bronner, and their company, CCC Filmkunst. Besides Crescendo, CCC has produced 5 of Stephen's scripts. And in addition to his global film work, Stephen has also written the television adaptation of Christopher Paul Curtis's award-winning novel, The Watsons Go to Birmingham. Stephen was a scholar in residence at Brandeis in 2008 and 2010, and he teaches a number of film and writing courses currently at Emerson College. Stephen, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be in Canada. I really wish I was there in person.
The air is different. You can feel it already. I thought we might begin talking about Crescendo, and then we would weave throughout your career and your process along the way. So something that struck me in the opening credits is that we have some interesting credits. We have an idea that was conceived by you, and in addition to a screenwriting credit, there's also a created by credit, which was an interesting one. And I thought maybe you could explain a little bit about what brought you to the story and your involvement in the story from the very beginning.
Okay, this will take about 4 hours.
We have time.
I would like from 2000 to about 2010. I would spend like about 2 or 3 months a year in Berlin, and Mr. Browner, who I worked for, who died last year at 101. We'll talk more about that later. I mean, we'd sort of go out and have a lot of meals. And talk about, like a variety of projects that he had wanted to do and never quite got off the ground. And so we were having lunch, and he just said, I had this idea from many, many, many years ago, and Daniel Barenboim stole it from me. And I said, oh, and, of course, Daniel Barenboim has his West East Divan Orchestra, which is made up of Palestinian and Arab musicians and Israeli musicians. And a lot of them live in Berlin on the same street. And he wanted to do a story kind of like that, but he didn't want to do Barenboim's story. He wanted to have it be about the musicians. So we started talking about it. And one of the interesting things about Artur is that he has very specific ideas about characters that he had met or encountered, especially in all his Holocaust films. So we started talking about who some of the characters might be, and then I was on a plane to Israel to start doing some research, which had its own problems there.
Well, what's interesting is I wonder how a film like this especially for people who don't know how independent films are financed and how they come together, it's an extremely difficult, arduous process. And it's a miracle when films do come together that aren't financed by a studio. So I wonder if you could talk a little about how CCC works, or how this film in particular came together.
Okay, well, one of the reasons that I like working for Mr. Brown and working in Germany and Europe is that a lot of, or mostly every single film is financed in some part by the government. I mean, you know, their ideas, like they have all these different film boards. In Germany, I think there are 10 or 12. And the idea is to keep film people working. So there isn't the pressure to have, you know, like these big budget tent pole movies.
Right.
So, you know, so there's a lot more creative freedom for me. With Crescendo, I mean, there were many drafts over the years. Like, oh, I never answered your question about the credits. Should I do that now and then?
Anytime. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, so Artur got, it was sort of his story, so we shared a story credit. By the end, you know, I had worked on it with the previous director named Marcus Rosenmuller, who did a lot of one of my films. And then for some reason, because of scheduling, Marcus couldn't continue, and Dror came on board. And Dror was the guy that we went to before we went to Marcus. Like Dror was the first choice. And there were some things that Dror wanted in the script that Artur didn't object to, but they couldn't quite seem to see eye to eye. So we kind of moved on. And then when Dror came on, he has a writer that he works with all the time, and he wanted to take a credit. You know, he worked on the script. And so they wanted to just sort of distinguish what I had done. They wanted to make it distinct from what they had done. I mean, the script hadn't changed that much, but there was, you know, there were several key elements that Dror really focused on. And the main one, like in the original drafts, it was way more about the politics between, you know, the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government, and the negotiations, like how do you even get these people across the border. And so he said, you know, I'm a very, I don't know, Byzantine, Baroque kind of writer. Like there's never been a subplot I didn't love. So he really focused the movie on the musicians, which was the most important part.
Right.
Okay, now to the financing. When it's always, it's very hard to finance anything at all about the Middle East. And as we were going through the draft and presenting them to the various film boards, like in Germany, the process is you have, you know, you have the script, and then you attach the director and some actors, and then you go to the film boards to, you know, to get the funding. And we were getting different reactions, like, oh, this script is way too much prejudice in favor of the Israelis. And they're going, oh, no, this draft really favors the Palestinians too much. And so our basic idea when we were, you know, creating the story is that if we weren't pissing everybody off, then we weren't doing our jobs.
Right.
So Artur had retired, and Elise had taken over the project in the company, and she, I mean, she's a PhD. She has her own talk show in Germany. She's brilliant. I mean, you cannot, she's the most enthusiastic person that you've ever met. And Artur, like at 99 years old, was still having nightmares about the Holocaust. And he was really, you know, he's so, I mean, he did 22 films just about the Holocaust alone, but we can talk about that a little later. So Elise was really happy. She finally got all the financing in place, and she was at a party at the Berlinale, at the Berlin Film Festival, and she gets a call on her phone, and a sort of a substantial piece of the financing had dropped out, and we were already, just about to go into pre-production, and everything was all set. So she's standing there in the middle of this cocktail party crying, and this guy walks up to her, and said, "Are you all right? You look upset." And then everything just poured out of her, just about the film and the story and the financing, and it was the guy, I forget his name, but it's the guy that owns Red Bull. And he said, "Okay, you got me," and he wrote her a check.
You're kidding.
I mean, not that night, but yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
so
Wow.
I mean, that it's really serendipitous to have that. I
Sure.
mean, that's getting struck by lightning, and it only happened like once in a lifetime.
That's incredible. I was going to ask, writing for basically a global crew, I mean, you're dealing with global producers and a director. Did you ever find that the process, that there was and I'm talking about screenwriting structure, was there a translation issue for you of going, that's not necessarily how I would go about structuring that. That seems like it's a European flair or flavor.
No, not so much about the structure itself. Like, one of the reasons I really love working in Germany and with other Europeans is that, number one, writers are treated much better. Like, they're much more respected, and there isn't kind of the pressure to have phony kind of movie moments, and so you're allowed much more freedom, and you're allowed to tell the stories more honestly. Like, you're not kind of backed in to a happy ending. So in terms of structure, I mean, basically they just want to make sure that the story works. There are plenty of highs and lows, but there isn't like, okay, what's the first act break, or what's the midpoint? Like, nobody's really concerned with that kind of jargon so much over there.
Well, I wonder, the film itself wants to stay grounded in real world circumstances, obviously, but the story of the maestro's orchestra and each of their traumas are fictionalized, right? But yet they seem as if they're ripped from the headlines, that each of these stories could have existed, can exist now.
Well, each of the stories did exist, except to people, who weren't involved directly in the film. I mean, when I went to Israel to do the research, it was hard to get Palestinians, to trust me. It was a little easier in Israel, but like, I had to be vetted before people would be willing to open up and tell me their family stories, because I mean, just like as it's portrayed, just hanging out with Israelis for Palestinians is problematic, and a lot of people would just consider you a traitor. I mean, I think that's why Layla's story just kind of grew and grew, because they had a lot more to risk. I mean, they were oftentimes betraying, their family, differing with their, the politics of various family members. But I mean, one of the most affecting things in the process of doing the research was that every person I talked to had lost somebody or knew somebody who had died.
Mhm.
So, I mean, they're small countries to begin with, but it's kind of an intimate kind of violence that hangs over them, and there's this kind of collective memory of pain in an ongoing way.
Mhm.
And like doing the research was pretty inspiring and pretty moving for me, because you don't want to screw it up. You don't want to get it wrong at all. Like there's a real obligation to have it be truthful.
Well, I think you and the director created, at least for me watching the film, an atmosphere of tension and oppression, especially in the checkpoint sequences where you realize, like putting yourself in that situation on a daily basis, is you take your life in your hands and these arbitrary decisions can get made that changes everything. And I think that was really communicated very, very
Yeah,
well.
well, drawer, I mean, we won't get too much into the politics, but most filmmakers in Israel are pretty solidly left-wing. And that's for sure about drawer. And that checkpoint scene was, that was one of the scenes that was always problematical, because there are a lot of times, the Palestinian orchestra members, got across the border through the checkpoints fine. And, in the Birnbaum Orchestra, there was, a message from the very highest echelons of the government that we got to let these young people in and don't, screw them up. And then it was a question of, we're down to one checkpoint scene, and how do we portray it? And I mean, I think I've never had a conversation with Dror about this, but I think the actor who played the guard might have been a little bit bigger than I would have liked to have seen. And that was such a big, powerful moment in the film. So, people always talk about that scene. I get yelled at and people throw things at me for it.
Well, it brought back, in terms of those types of movies, I got echoes of, the papers scene in a lot of Holocaust films. Anytime it's show me your papers, and then you're fumbling for them, and the stress and tension that arises out of that, you see that played out here as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, Israeli TV and movies are really incredible, like maybe the last 5 or 10 years. And they're in some of them, it really portrays what life is like on the Palestinian side. One of the things that Dror felt is that, especially in the West, in the United States, people have an idea what life is like in Israel, but we're clueless about what it's like on the other side. And if you look at the way Arabs are portrayed in most movies, pretty much everybody is a terrorist, or many of the characters. And I've often thought about it is like, wow, what would I feel like if I was an actor from one of those countries, and okay, do I have to play another terrorist? And it's the same thing with Latinx people, like in Hollywood movies and TV shows, they're all gangbangers.
Right.
And I, the older I get, the more powerful I think these images are, and how we can't get them out of our heads, even if we want to.
I wanted to ask, one of the things that I always seem to look for or find in films are patterns, and we have these dueling pairs in the film. You have, if you think about it, you have Edward, the maestro, and Carla, the altruist. You have Ron and Layla, and you have Shira, and you have Omar. So these are your three sort of key relationships that seem to really drive the film forward. And I wonder if you could talk a little about just crafting characters like that, and finding that drama within those relationships?
Well, Archer and I really wanted to have a Romeo and Juliet story be part of this film. And we spent a lot of time with Omar and Shira. In another draft, I mean, Shira was like, a lot of the film was from this like video blog that Shira was keeping. And for me, they were kind of the real heart of the movie. With Ron and Layla, I mean, it was really fun to write them. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes into writing that never makes it on the screen, you know, a ton of stuff. And so in my world, Steve world, Ron's family lived in a settlement, right? They were Russian immigrants who had kind of done well in Israel, and they had a beautiful suburban house. And, you know, down in the valley was Layla's village, and they had kind of known each other since they were kids, which we, you know, that sort of background never quite made it into the film, which was fine. And you know, I guess Ron's arrogance, you know, a lot of it was Daniel's, you know, really, really great performance. And I think one of the things that didn't come out in the film was like what his real feelings might have been for her, besides the, you know, the professional you know, competition. And I think I think that was part of the way that Dror directed it, because I mean, he just wanted to cut out everything that was extraneous to the players and the music.
Speaking of music, I wanted to ask, how did you and the director go about choosing or including the specific musical selections, and how they ended up sort of folding into the narrative?
Well, one of, like, a huge Mahler fan and a Gustavo Dudamel, you know, groupie. So I was pushing for that. And Dror, being much smarter than I am, was going, you know, he's just putting this orchestra together with, you know, players of various abilities. I think any intelligent conductor would have them start with something a little simpler that they could handle. And so, you know, that was how the Pachelbel got in there. I mean, we went back and forth about the music. It was like the last 300 years of classical music. And then the last scene with Ravel and the Bolero, we just could not figure out what to play there.
At the airport, yeah.
At the airport. And Elise had seen something, I don't know. She was in an airport and a kid was on the other side of the glass playing Bolero, and she said, "Oh my God." I mean, something like that. I don't remember exactly, but it's like, that's it.
Right.
And then when she told me it was Bolero, I was like, "Oh my God, no, whatever, not that." Because when I was in college and I was in a fraternity for a year, and like that pledge night thing, we listened to Bolero for like 12 hours straight. So I cannot hear that piece of music with a straight face, or, you know, going, "Oh my God, I'm going to go crazy if I hear that again." But I got over that. The music works great.
I mean, I also like the inclusion of Dvorak's New World Symphony. So you
Yeah,
can also think metaphorically of, oh, the New World, the Largo movement is this dawning of something new. And here you have the coming together of these two factions, creating something new.
yeah.
Again, it works on two levels, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, when I'm working on a movie, I mean, writing a movie, the first thing I have to do is find the, oh my
there's
God,
my cat. Oh, there she goes. Sorry.
yes, um, the right piece of music that will sort of get me through the process. And um, for this, it was, Mahler's second with Dunmel conducting at the BBC proms. I mean, there's another film, like an earlier film, where the New World, I must have listened to it like 300 times. I drive everybody around me crazy.
I like Fritz Reiner's old RCA stereo version. That one's
Mm.
awesome. Yeah, no, I was also thinking specifically of, I mean, there's such a sense of melancholy, right, at the end of the film. We're obviously still processing Omar's death, and the two groups are again separated. But Bolero does give a sense of hope. And obviously you do
Yeah,
have, it's a bittersweet ending, but at least it does close it on that optimistic note, I think. Um, how involved were you? Like, obviously, you had some involvement in the production of the film. Once the script is written, usually a screenwriter, or sometimes a screenwriter says, I'm not involved anymore. But I wonder what your involvement was.
well, I mean, it depends. Usually, it depends on the screenwriter's relationship with the director. I mean, what happens a lot of time when there's screenwriters on the set, if the actor delivers the line not to the screenwriter's liking, they'll they'll go up to the actor and say, you really screwed up that line. So like a lot of times screenwriters on a set are just basically a nightmare. But I was, had finished my work before they were in production. But there's some, I mean, it was an amazing process from what I've heard. Like all the musicians were musicians except for the lead, except for Peter Simonovich, Sabrina, Mehdi, and Ayan. And everybody else was, an amateur, somebody who'd never acted before.
Wow.
And so one of the things that Dror did was that he had all the actors do the prejudice, reduction exercises that was portrayed in the film, done before. And everybody, they went through the exercises and, oh, this was great. Shooting's going to be, great. We're a family, but we can really do this. We've resolved our differences, at least for the sake of producing this, and like we can work with each other. Because there was a lot of suspicion in the beginning, but once Dror said action, like basically all hell broke loose. And a lot of, I mean, they weren't acting. A lot of what they had been suppressed, from really expressing their feelings, on both sides, just really came out. And I mean, they had to stop shooting twice, send people home. And there were a couple of times, I won't name the actors, but where they actually got so flipped out, they passed out.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
so it was pretty intense.
Do you find that, I mean, working with CCC Films has yielded a lot of creative flexibility to you over the years?
Yeah, I mean, well, Artur, he's really, I don't know the best way to put it, but he loves the movie business, loves movies. After the war, he was a Polish Jew, but he had business in Germany, and his family a lot of people were emigrating to Israel, and he said, no, I'm going to Berlin. These people aren't going to kick me out of my part of the world. and he started buying up real estate. And like the family is like one of the biggest owners of real estate in
Wow.
Berlin. But he did the first Holocaust film in 1946 called Moratori. And he's done 22 altogether. I did the last 5, I think. And I mean, I've never met another human being who's more dedicated to the idea of, never forget. And he was just such a delightful, human being. And one of the, like, you don't make as much money in Germany, but he would say, like, write anything you want, and we'd talk about movies, and I'd go off and write it. But it was a little bit of seduction, because the movies that he always made were the Holocaust films. Like, the other ones were to keep me happy. And I mean, we still have some projects like that aren't Holocaust films that CCC will do at some point. But he was really, like, when you talk to him, you really understood film history. Like, he had worked with everybody, like Fritz Lang and Otto Preminger. I had 2 projects that we never quite got off the ground with István Szabó, the great Hungarian director. But he just, to him, like, life was just filled with possibility, despite his background. They treated me like family when I was there. I'd have Sunday dinner with them all the time. And Alice is, we do really feel, I do feel like part of the family. And I've never had that in any kind of business relationship.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems so rare to talk about a long-term relationship like that in the movie business, which seems so nomadic and independent, where you're going from project to project, meeting new people with each one. Here you have almost like a stable relationship with somebody who is willing to work with you on, like you said, on projects that interested you.
Yeah, I think about him all the time still, even though he died like a year and a half ago.
I wonder, one thing that struck me was the cold open to the film. And I wonder, having the 2 characters, Shira and Omar, have the little video thing, and then before credits, we have the confrontation with security, and we return to this right at the end of the film. And I wonder if that structure, was that part of your original script? I mean, or sometimes those things can be in editing.
Honestly, I don't kind of remember. There were so many drafts. Originally we were going to shoot the film in Yalta, and that's where the peace conference was. And I'll get to why. And then the Russians invaded, so we couldn't do it. Artur, we wanted to do it there because it was, where the Yalta Peace Conference was Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, and it was really a beautiful, beautiful city, and it was also cheap for Artur to shoot in. He was very shrewd that way. And then, after we couldn't go there anymore, we had sort of various locations. God, I can't even remember your question. I got sidetracked.
The cold open.
The cold open.
If that was sort of an editing.
So the original, I remember the draft. That scene was in a garden in Yalta.
Okay.
So I think it was that cold open.
Because that really centers the story on Shira and Omar, right?
Yeah.
If you start with them and there's some dramatic something that's going to happen to them, we want to get back to that. It automatically positions you or aligns you with those 2 characters.
There was another opening with a woman with mopping the floor, like on the level of the auditorium where the rehearsal was going on. upstairs, and she was really mopping. But God, I don't get, like, I could do an hour on all the different openings of the movie.
Yeah, well, and the choice that's ultimately made does the job of aligning you with those characters, and I think that's important. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
character identification is so important. I wonder if you could talk a little about. I mean, we talked about CCC's Holocaust films, and a lot of your work, even since I'd say like around 2000, seems to center around Jewish identity, the Holocaust, World War II. I wonder what motivated that direction in your work, if it was conscious on your part, or a series of opportunities that simply led that way.
Well, I was living in LA, and one of my very first film jobs, I was kind of doing PR in a film that Yvonne Passer, you should know who he is, who passed away last year. I mean, he used to be head of the graduate school at USC for everybody else. And so he and I became friends, and then we both moved out to LA about the same time. And I had convinced him to do a TV movie for NBC that I'd written, and he had never done one before. And there was this one scene in the movie that he really, really wanted to do. And it's kind of a long story about what the scene is. But he just really wanted to direct that scene, and he made NBC actually sign a contract that under no circumstances would they cut the scene. Yvonne Passer, for everybody else, was like Milos Forman's best friend. They went to film school together. He did that, an amazing thriller called Cutter and Bone, or Cutter's Way, with John Hurd and Jeff Bridges. And he did the Stalin miniseries with Robert Duvall. And so NBC cut the scene, of course, and Yvonne was outraged. And he said, we have to write a letter. And I said, okay, we'll write a letter. So he said, you write the letter. So I wrote the letter, and then, because I was upset about it also, it doesn't take me a lot to get upset about stuff like that. And he said, you know what, I'm the director, so they'll know I'm prejudiced. You're the pure person, so you sign the letter just from you. So I copied the head of movies and miniseries at NBC. I wrote the letter to them. I copied the head of NBC, and I copied the head of GE, which was the parent company. And at the time, I had like a 4-picture deal at NBC, but they're so angry, you know, that they just sort of told me to get lost. And I was, you know, I mean, part of me was upset, and part of me was like, oh, what the hell? But Yvonne always felt guilty. So he said, like, I'm doing this movie in Germany. I'm working for this crazy guy named Arthur Brauner. And, you know, we're doing a project about the Golem myth. You know, the script's terrible. You have to start over and rewrite it. And I said, sure. So I went to Berlin and started to talk about the script with Mr. Brauner. And I was there for like 24 hours. And he said to me, you have to do me a favor. And I said, what? And he said, you have to go to Minsk and recut a movie that's really in trouble there. And we kind of just got along. And he asked me to do a film about Babi Yar, which, you know, is the movie about 35,000 Jews massacred. And I said, what do I know? I'm a middle-class Jewish kid from Rhode Island, and I know very, very little about the Holocaust, and I certainly don't know anybody who died. I mean, it turned out that I did, but I just didn't know it when I was growing up. So that was the start. And that was, movie came out in 2001 or 2002. And that's another saga. But, you know, like, he always swears that he's never going to do another Holocaust movie. And I always swear that I'm never going to write one. And then we find a story that we just have to write. And that's how it went.
Is that how the book project, Clara's Work, came about?
Um, yeah, well, I had been doing so much research. When I started doing that, I think I'd written already like maybe 4 or 5 Holocaust films for Archer. Not everyone had been made, but like when you're doing research, like if you read memoirs or you read, research, I mean, the only real meaty thing that really tells you what it was like are either letters or diaries. So I'd been discovering all these diaries, written by children. And then I said, well, there's got to be a project here. Somebody has to collect all these. So a friend of mine from Providence, where I grew up, helped me get a grant from the Rhode Island Holocaust Museum, and they sent me, to Europe and to Israel and across the states collecting diaries. And I found Clara's diary at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. And oddly enough, I asked them for her if they knew where her address, what her address was, so I could get in contact with them. And they didn't have her address, but they sort of knew where she was from. So I started calling federations in northern New Jersey, and they hooked me up with her in like 10 minutes.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. I wanted to ask about your work, your adaptation of Christopher Paul Curtis's book, The Watsons Go to Birmingham. And for those in Hamilton watching and who may not know Curtis, Curtis is an author from Michigan, but who lives in Windsor, and the book is a Newbery award-winning book. And I wonder if you could talk a little about your involvement with that.
Yeah. Well, back in 1988, I had sold I pitched an idea about this guy. It's a true story about the first Black mayor in Mississippi since Reconstruction, who'd been framed for murder. And I was good friends with a guy named Danny Sheehan and his wife, Sarah Nelson, who had a public interest law firm. And they did the Silkwood case. They,
Oh, wow.
3 Mile Island. And Danny told me about this story about Eddie, and I pitched it to Paramount through a friend of mine who's working with Mace Neufeld, who does all the Tom Clancy movies. So it was really, really a pretty good script. And so whenever there was anything that was African American themed, they brought me in. Like, that script got me a lot of work. And so originally, it was being produced by a white guy named David Michaels, but the director he was working with was a guy named LeVar Burton, Reading Rainbow and Roots, and really love LeVar. I mean, he was a great, great guy. And we set it up at CBS. And we had an amazing cast. We had Whoopi Goldberg, Danny Glover, Alfre Woodard. And it really kind of captured all the comedy, in the book. And, Whoopi Goldberg played the grandma. And we had a green light. We were scheduled to go into production, and there was a new president of CBS, and he wanted, any African-American stories to be more urban and not as soft as, the Watsons, which is like, I don't know how soft it is. It's about the Birmingham bombing of 4 little girls. But I mean, one of the reasons I did want to work in Europe more is that, the Watsons was one of, 3 sort of heartbreaking Hollywood stories about movies that would have been great. So, the project, we just couldn't get any traction with it. And then, like years later, I got a call that, that Spike Lee's wife, Tanya, wanted to do the movie. And we were, we were kind of thrilled, but also like the tone of her draft was a lot more serious. Like like the sort of times in the 10 years, intervening years, it was really quite a different political situation. And there were, people who really, lots and lots of kids especially, who knew nothing about the Birmingham bombings, and she kind of wanted it to be more of a teaching moment. So some of the humor was gone, but I think she did like Kenny Leone, the director, did a great job. The cast, was great. But it's one of those times when the movie in your head is a little different than the way it turned out, and then you kind of have to get over that and just go, oh my God, this was, I was so happy that the movie was made.
Well, and I think for those sort of interested in craft in terms of translating something from a novel to the screen, the Watsons is a great example because it's a very episodic narrative, and there are vignettes of this boy's life. And so there is no real through line to the book, except in the end, you get them to go on this trip. And I wonder, in any of your work, when you're doing that kind of adaptation, how you find that through line in a script, which seems to be more of a requirement than in a novel, where you can be a little more flexible with that.
You have to find your own reasons for making the movie, why you want to write the movie, apart from the author of the original novel. And you have to find the character who's the main point of view in the book. And so for me, in the Watsons, it was the grandmom in Birmingham, who was the catalyst. I mean, she was the strongest character. She was the one who was going to whip her grandchild into shape, and she was kind of this almost mythic force that is really at the heart and the core of many Black families.
Mm-hmm.
And she was also in the book. You just kind of fall in love with her in the book, and you're building the through line to get to her. So you want a lot of tension in the early scenes where the family seems like on its last legs, the family's falling apart, and unless they get to Birmingham,
Right.
really bad things are gonna happen.
So in the few minutes we have left, I wanted to go all the way back, and I wanted to ask, what interested you in the screen trade and getting into the movie business? What motivated that all the way?
Okay, well, what I used to tell people was that I never wanted to have a job where I had to wear long pants, and I wanted to live by the beach. And screenwriting looked like the proper thing for that. But I think underneath that, like, I grew up in the 60s, and it's kind of a subject that you don't really talk about. Like, I couldn't talk about it when I was younger. But, I really believe in the transformational qualities, power of film. And, in terms of writers, I mean, novelists, the ones who really kind of inspired me the most were, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, the autobiography of Malcolm X. So I've always had that, I grew up next to the family, the guy who was like the head of the NAACP, and Providence and in Rhode Island, and my girlfriend in high school and college were Quakers, and I mean, I was just a little bit on fire, wanting to change the world. And I think, that's the reason why I wanted to write films, to be able to be part of something that can really have, affect people and affect kind of change in some way, even if it's tiny.
Mhm. And did you start in television?
It's another, yeah. I had written a script that John Carpenter was going to do with Adrienne Barbeau, and it never quite got made. And my friend Mart, whose house, this is to go back to the beginning of the story, who lived in Bernard Herrmann's guest house, was the producer of a TV series called Heart to Heart. And he hired me, and I sold everything in New York and moved out there. He picks me up at the airport and said, guess what, I have great news. I couldn't stand it any longer, I quit. But you'll be okay. Of course I wasn't okay once he left, because the new producer fired up all of his people and brought in news. So I was really out of like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? And through a friend, I got a job cleaning up the hair of a Paul Mitchell infomercial, which was sort of like the low light of my career in Hollywood. But there's a guy from my hometown named Donald Kushner, and he lived around the corner. His mom and my mom were friends, and she said, call up Donald. I heard he's got something going out there. So he had just produced Tron. But he and his partner had a whole division of reality TV shows. And I started working on this thing called Divorce Court, which was like a totally scripted show. I had to write 4 scripts a week. And I ended up, producing the show for like 3 or 4 years. And then I kind of got into long form. So the answer is yes, I started in television. It was like the most fun job I've ever had. Like anything went. We had like 20 scripts about Elvis impersonators. And we shot 4 TV shows a day. I mean, it's really crazy.
Wow. Well, for anyone who grew up in the early 90s, watching Divorce Court at like 1 p.m. was like tune in television when you're not in school.
Well, I mean, our big rivals, for anybody who's old enough, like my age, was a show called The People's Court with Judge Wapner.
Mm-hmm.
And the big event of the year was when our softball teams played each other. Like we had uniforms, we had like satin jackets, and it was really a trip. And like you'd be wearing your jacket in line in Westwood at the movie theater, and people would come up to you and ask you, did you get that jacket because you were divorced on Divorce Court? Like people thought it was real.
Right. I bet.
Yeah.
Before we go, you mentioned John Carpenter. I have to ask about John Carpenter. Any interesting anecdote before we adjourn about John?
No. I mean, I met him once or twice, but like he wanted to do the movie with Adrienne Barbeau, but okay, the film was like the second script I had written. The first film was sort of autobiographical about a guy who wants to be a stand-up comic, but we won't go there. The second film was about a medical student living in Brooklyn who figures out that one of her professors was a Nazi, and it was a horror movie. And Adrienne Barbeau was going to play the medical student. Yeah.
What could have been? That sounds like, yeah.
Hey. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of could have beens.
Yeah.
but you know, like on the basis of that deal, it got me more work. I mean, just, you know, people want to know who you're doing business with and who's, so even by osmosis, you know, it really had a pretty positive effect on my career and my life.
Well, and one that did get made, and thankfully so, was Crescendo. And we
Yeah.
thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me tonight and taking questions from the audience, which I was drawing from. So thank you so much. I really appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
Hopefully we can do this again if you continue to work with the folks at CCC.
Well, yeah, we have, believe it or not, that Golem film that I first wrote for them like over 20 years ago. I think we're going to do that, but I think we're going to do that in the US and not in Germany. So it'll be the first US, you know, production they'll have. And there's also got an adaptation of Peer Gynt that we hope to get done.
That's awesome. Well, that is incredible. Well, thank you again. And thank you for everybody who is here on Zoom.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I wish I could see all your faces. It's kind of lonely up here in the Berkshires. It's like you're in it. It's like, you know, like in these Zoom things, you kind of feel a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. Like, you know, behind the curtain, there's this face.
Oh, I know. And you just end up staring at yourself and part of the window here, which is frightening. But
yeah, it's hard to work the room when there's no room to work.
Exactly. Well, I think this was fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah,
So
really,
thank you, Steve.
Great interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. All right, everyone. Have a great night.
Okay. Bye-bye.